Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all here today. My name is Grace Scully, and I am the Membership Engagement Manager for IOB. Thank you for coming today to this taster. It's for the Professional Certificate for Designated Persons in a Fund Management Company. This is to give you all an overview of the programme and an insight into the type of material that will be covered throughout the 12 weeks. So I am delighted to welcome Paula Kelleher, Killian Buckley, along with Richard Wayne and Mark White, who will be discussing the programme in detail. Margaret Darcy is also joining us, the Programme Director, for this discussion, and she is on hand to answer any of the questions you might have on the programme itself. So before we start, I'd just like to let you know that the session is being recorded and there is no CPD for this, so there's no need for codes or anything like that. So I would like to ask you, if you have any questions on the programme, please pop them into the Q&A box below, and Margaret will answer them for you if there's enough time. If there's not enough time, we will be doing up an FAQ and it'll be sent out to everyone who's registered for this event today. Okay, so now over to you, Paula.
Thank you very much, Grace. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paula Kelleher, and I am the Head of Trust and Depository for the Bank of New York Mellon's European Bank. But I'm also a member of the IOB, the Funds Advisory Board. And for this afternoon session, following the introduction of the CBI CP86 and then the subsequent guidance issued by the CBI, the funds team in IOB has taken the lead in establishing this UCD accredited programme. And the purpose is to provide training to assist those who are currently discharging DP functions, but those who wish to do so, and indeed other professionals in fund industry firms. So to that end, we are joined today by the module coordinator and programme lead and the lecturers, all of whom who have designed the course content and will be lecturing on the programme. So given the short time we have today, I won't spend long on the bios, but I think these people are well known to most of you. And the bios are available on the IOB event page and in the brochure for this programme. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Killian Buckley, an industry veteran and previously the head of management company solutions across Ireland and Luxembourg for Duff & Phelps. And Killian is the module coordinator and programme lead for this programme throughout. We also are joined by Richard Wayne, who's the former CEO of Vanguard Group in Ireland Limited, and Mark White, who's the head of the Investment Management Group in McCann Fitzgerald. So this event today has been structured in the form of a Q&A session, and I have the pleasure today of asking some questions which I trust will answer some of your questions about the programme and provide some further background information to you, which will assist you in deciding whether or not this course is for you. We will have time, as Grace has said, for questions at the end of the session, but in the meantime, I would encourage you to put your questions into the chat to make sure that we pick them up. Margaret will be joining us at the end of the session and will answer what questions time permits. But for those questions that we don't get to today, Margaret will take them away and respond to them after the event. The course details themselves, in particular around the duration, the timing and price, etc., all of these details about the programme, they are set out in the course brochure, which is available on the IOB website. But hopefully some of those and the other questions you may have will be answered in this session today. So Killian, I'll start with you, please, if I may, and would just invite you to provide a brief overview of the course and what you expect it to deliver, please.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks to IOB for setting up this session. I think as we were looking to design this course, the one thing that stood out for us was to make this as practical and interactive as possible. So, you know, in terms of a lecture structure, PowerPoint and going through slide after slide, we were anxious that this wasn't just delivered to students, but that they really took part in it as well. So from that perspective, I will go into some of the detail on the course, but I think what we mainly do want to say is that we're looking for this to be participatory, and we want students to take part in as much as the fact that we hope that people will come from different aspects of the industry, bringing their own knowledge, their own angle, their own take. So we think that, you know, bringing that all together into good classroom discussions, in terms of workshops and polls, will be very helpful for students in terms of developing their knowledge within the designated person sphere. So I think that's kind of a key takeaway I would hope for those listening to this event. In terms of the actual structure and content, we're focusing on a number of different areas. We were sort of struck with the need to make sure that those engaging in this training had the fundamentals of the industry from both a legal and a regulatory perspective. So the first number of lectures Mark will deliver and can talk a little bit further on will deal with the legal and regulatory framework from a designated person perspective. And I think, as we know, that the designated person role is so overlapping and so multilateral that there are quite a number of different areas that students should have a reasonably good take on. Outside of the CP86 guidance, but into areas such as MIFID and EMIR and other regulatory authorizations that are there from both an Irish and a European perspective. So I guess having had that grounding in the technical fundamental legal side, we're looking to move on then to I guess the fundamentals of appointment and the fundamentals of documentation. So looking at the DP contract, looking at what a DP needs to know in taking on a role, should they wish to take on that role. And looking at the documentation then that I guess instructs the way in which they perform their role. So the business plan, the program activity, risk management framework, policies and procedures, all of these will have a sort of a clear line of sight for the designated person in terms of their responsibility and accountability to that documentation, then to the other delegates that may be in place within the structure. Following that sort of again grounding of what is required, I think we're going to move into a sort of a more softer side of the DP role, which Richard kindly will deliver, which looks at DP mindset and the soft skills that are necessary, the challenge that is necessary, scenarios that may occur that make that difficult. Because again, that designated person role is sometimes in between service providers and the board as a sort of a senior management member. So that can lead to challenges in terms of how you perform the role itself. We're then going to move on to looking at I guess the fund complex and structure as a whole and how the DP interacts with each of those parts. So be that administrator, custodian, the board itself, even in fact the investor, which I think is something that we want to have coming throughout the entire program, is that ultimately the designated person has a fiduciary duty to the investor, and we shouldn't forget that in performing the role. So what's the angle that those service providers are bringing to their discussions with the designated person? And then finally, our final lecture will look at engagement with the central bank. So what are the tools and powers the central bank has in terms of scrutinizing and supervising management companies? Where does a designated person sit in that interaction? And indeed, as part of that final lecture, we'll look at central bank interviews and how a designated person might perform within those. So we've spent a long time looking at this, and there are so many areas we could cover. We only have a certain amount of time, but we think through those sort of 4 areas particularly, we're covering off the majority of what's necessary from a designated person perspective.
Thank you very much, and that's a super overview of what will certainly be a very comprehensive course. But Mark, from your perspective, I know Killian has touched on the legal and reg. What are you hoping that the outcome from the course for the students will be?
Thanks, Paula. So as you say, I think Killian has given a very good overview of the various different modules in the course. From my perspective, particularly looking at the legal and regulatory aspects, my hope is that the students would end up with a good understanding of the overall legal and regulatory framework that govern fund management companies in Ireland. So what we're talking about here is obviously UCITS management companies and AIFMs. So much of the governance framework is underpinned by law, whether that's EU law or Irish law, and also by regulation. So we do see as really an essential knowledge, at least a basic working knowledge of those areas for anybody who is looking to undertake any one of the DP functions. So the purpose of the legal and regulatory lectures is not really designed to be solely a lecture on the laws and regulations governing fund management companies. We're not trying to create more lawyers as a result. God knows the world has enough lawyers as it is, but it's more to do with that the DPs have an understanding of the EU and the CBI legal and regulatory framework governing fund management companies, because so much of what the central bank has done in relation to CP86 and subsequent iterations has its foundations in EU law, and whether that's coming from directives or EU regulation, or in addition to pronouncements from the Commission, from the ESAs and from ESMA. So it's really important that DPs understand, how their roles and their functions as described in the central bank framework fit within the overall legal and regulatory framework. So we think an understanding of the regulatory requirements in relation to those areas, and also in relation to areas such as, say, delegation and outsourcing, would also be useful for students. And then a working knowledge. Killian mentioned some other EU and domestic legislation, which is important. So that will also be included in the 2 modules, because it's important that the DPs within fund management companies are kept abreast of all legal and regulatory developments that apply to fund management companies and their businesses. So I suppose they will be the kind of the building blocks, if you like, because the legal and regulatory framework is so heavy in this area, that hopefully by giving the students a working knowledge of the key aspects, why this stuff was introduced, what it's designed to achieve, and trying to provide some sort of a practical application of what these laws and regulations mean for them, and why their DP roles have been designed in that way.
Thank you very much. That's really interesting, Mark. And Richard, I'll turn to you and we'll take a slightly different look at things. Killian touched on the hard and the soft learning, but quite an emphasis on the latter, the soft side. And he also mentioned, the kind of hoping for the kind of participatory nature of the course where students will get involved. Would you just tell us a little bit of, how you think that will work out, and what will be covered in the course around those areas, please?
Sure, Paula. Yeah. Look, we've emphasized the soft skill side of things because we think these skills are just as important as the technical knowledge that you should already have in your field of expertise. That's outside of the legal and regulatory background and detail that Mark will go through. When you get to this level, you're at a designated person level, or you want to get there, your technical knowledge is really almost a given. You can all read the rules as well, but it's so important about how do you approach people who you're going to have relationships going forward? How do you use your knowledge to ask the right questions? How do you emphasize skills you've probably got already as you've got to a certain level of analysis, of investigation, of your constructive challenge and questioning, showing your independence of mind, essentially, because all those are things that are going to be required in your role, and they all require a bit of time and preparation and a bit of experience. So it's worth spending a little bit of time, we thought, on this course, emphasizing that aspect of the role, as we called it, the DP mindset. They really do matter when you're building relationships and when you're looking to perform a role such as a designated person.
And that's really important. I think that's really well clarified, because, as you say, the technical pieces are a given, but kind of approaching it with the right mindset is certainly important. I'll stick with you, Richard, for a moment, if you don't mind. And again, something Killian touched on, looking at the group structure, ManCos, etc. But maybe can you tell us a little bit about this? Will you be looking at this from a third party as well as a group ManCo perspective in the programme?
Most definitely, yes. We want to look at it, constructive challenge in my area, but I'm sure in all the other areas as well. And the conflicts that can arise, Killian's already hinted at a few of those we might be talking about, both in the situations where you're within a group and also where you're a third-party ManCo. It's going to be great, hopefully, to have a mix of people on this course who are living in those worlds. And as Killian emphasized at the beginning, we're looking to hopefully have a very participatory element to this course, because we'd love people to be sharing their expectation. Problem shared is a problem halved is a phrase I think translates pretty much everywhere. And we often find that when you get people together in similar roles, they do experience similar issues and challenges, and we'll be able to talk through those. But we'll make that, constructive throughout, but we will be looking at it from every perspective that we can, yes.
And Mark, just kind of building on from that, I mean, that is a very important issue, looking at the whole group kind of perspective. Do you have any of your own views on this from the legal perspective?
Yeah, I do, because I suppose as we advise different types of mancos, whether they're group mancos or proprietary mancos versus the third-party mancos, or even those entities that started off as group mancos but might now start to undertake third-party management company for hire business. I mean, you know, the requirements imposed on DPs of fund management companies will be largely the same, you know, regardless of whether you're a third-party manco for hire or whether you're a group or proprietary manco. You know, in terms of how the DP has to discharge its duties, that can vary somewhat, because one of the things that the central bank has always talked about, almost since I can remember, you know, the introduction of any of this type of regime, is always looking at what the bank refers to as the nature, scale, and complexity of something. And actually, that's a phrase that for those of us who have been living and breathing EU regulation for many, many years, it's something which is reiterated time and time again to companies in terms of how they adapt, how they apply, and how they comply with requirements. A lot of it is based on nature, scale, and complexity. So while you might expect that, you know, a DP for investment management or for regulatory compliance or risk functions or whatever, you know, the rules that are required of them, you know, are the same between a third-party manco and a proprietary manco. The reality is that, you know, a third-party manco's business, you might expect a higher nature, or a higher degree, I should say, of nature, scale, and complexity. Because, you know, for example, if you think about the role of a DP for investment management or fund risk, you know, even a very large proprietary manco, they may have different strategies, but the chances are that the main delegate that they have, the investment manager, is the same. Whereas if you're a third-party manco, you are going to have multiple delegates. And you know, when you have multiple delegates, you clearly increase risk, because your ability to oversee multiple delegates who do things in a very different way, and who are all undertaking, you know, the management of strategies in a different way, you would expect has to add to the complexity of the role associated with the DP for investment management, I would think, in a third-party manco. So, you know, for example, you know, the DPs in those third-party mancos need to have you know, a lot of support around the functions that they undertake, because they are being spread across a number of different clients. And I think that when you do increase, you know, particularly numbers of delegates, you are potentially increasing operational risk, and you're increasing the manner in which those DPs conduct their functions. So at a basic level, you might say the requirements are the same, but I do think the nature, scale, and complexity of the business might dictate that there needs to be greater support around third-party mancos. And I think that's something that has been called out a couple of times by ESMA. You know, they're really focusing on the whole substance. Third-party mancos, I think Richard makes a really good point about conflicts as well. You know, the tail wagging the dog. You know, the whole point is, you know, that an investment manager comes along and, you know, I select a manco, but, you know, contractually and legally, the manco appoints them. So what happens if, you know, in the turkeys voting for Christmas scenario, that there's a problem with the delegate? So that, I think there's some of the things that we're gonna address and touch on as well.
Yeah. Guys, this is a really interesting discussion, because it's very clear, you know, there's a need. And Killian, this might be sort of an easy question for you based on what we've heard, but, you know, why did the IOB then decide to put on the programme, and I suppose to cover some of these areas?
Indeed, yeah. And I know, Paula, we were discussing for the lecture, I first performed a designated person role in 2010. If you can imagine, it's that long ago. So, you know, the journey to where we are now has been, you know, it has been a long one in some senses. And I think it's probably fair to say in 2010, when I did form that, the role was treated with some skepticism within the industry, particularly from service providers. So, you know, there's been a few speed bumps, let's say, that have got us to here. In fairness to, you know, the Central Bank of Ireland, particularly, the direction of travel in terms of good governance when it comes to fund management companies has been clearly set since 2016, the original consultation around CP86. And as Paula, you had mentioned earlier, the Dear Chair letter that came out last October, that I think basically said this is the way it is. This is what you need to do. So I think what we've seen is that the regulation has developed. It has got more robust. It has got more prescriptive. There is more guidance in place, which is actually helpful. You know, a better position to be in than you know, a blank sheet of paper in terms of performing these kind of roles. But equally, obviously, we've seen macro events such as Brexit, you know, such as Mark had mentioned, ESMA's focus on substance within fund management companies highlight, you know, the good governance nature that is needed within fund management companies. And Ireland, as you know, along with Luxembourg particularly, let's say, is the centre of excellence for this sort of structure. And so both within the Irish funds industry and then within IOB, there's been I guess a push to make Ireland that centre for good governance when it comes to management company structures, and a large part of that is the designated person role itself. The industry has a large amount of technically very, very strong people that are well able to perform these roles. What we're trying to do here is just to sort of provide some guidance around the nature of that challenge. And for those individuals who take on the course, to leave it with the confidence of both having interacted with their peers, which I think again is back to that point, I think is really important in terms of the course engagement, but also that from the harmonized perspective, what is necessary within those roles, they feel they have that tool in their back pocket when it comes to this certificate.
And that's all really important and interesting. And as the program lead, then I'd ask you one more. So based on all of that and all the things you've outlined for those who are already doing the role and going to learn how to do it, how will the program be assessed? So just an overview of what you'll be looking for or the deliverables, if you like.
Yeah, so I mean, we're certainly not looking to kind of overcomplicate the assessment process. So, I guess we have two aspects to that. First, we will have a written assignment, which will be set during the course. And the details of that will be in the study guide, which will form part of the course guide. And that will be 40% of the marks. Then the remainder of the marks, so the 60%, will be given to what's known as a learning journal. So those listening may be familiar with that term. It's used in other IOB courses, and I think a learning journal is, for want of a better phrase, a reflective log, let's say, on the learning journey that those individuals have gone through. So it looks at what have they learned, how have they applied that to their own careers, in terms of that learning, what is their analysis in terms of the course itself, and how has that developed over the course of the 10 lectures that were there. So that would then be assessed at the end of the course.
That's really helpful, thank you, and really interesting. I'm just conscious of time. I might just take a look at the chat at this stage and hand over to Margaret, just if you are going to, let's see if we've got questions for the guys here.
Thanks a million, Paula. I do indeed. I think this first one is for Killian. Are the first, second and third lines of defence covered in the course? So example, what would you consider the first, second and third lines of defence in a MANCO, an AFM structure when DPs are oversight functions?
Yeah, so I think this goes to one of the particular lectures where we're looking at the various stakeholders that impact the designated person role. So, naturally, the nature of the designated person role is quite overlapping. So as you're a designated person for regulatory compliance, you might also be the head of compliance within a fund management company, or there may be other compliance functions within that management company itself. So how do they interact? Where does the line of responsibility begin and end? Equally, internal audit can be part of a designated person function, but there could also be an outsourced internal audit function. So absolutely, I think this is one of the key areas actually in terms of negotiating potential minefields in some senses of where a designated person fits into the various lines of oversight and supervision within a management company.
Perfect, thank you so much for that. I'm just checking to see some of the questions are quite long, so we may run out of time. So I'm just to let people know I am actually holding on to the questions, so we will get answers for those to you, so don't worry about that. A question here about what models exist currently when applying CP86 supervision of delegates. Just it might be too long a question to answer in this context, and we can put something.
Yeah, I see that question. I'm not exactly sure what that's getting at, so I might leave it. Yeah,
we'll take a look and think about it. So just to let people know that there is another event coming up on the 23rd of July, which is going to focus, the topic would be Ireland's commitment to excellence in fund management company governance, and it's going to be led by Derval Rowland. So that is available on our website to register for now. I think Grace has put in that link to it. So that might be worth a while for people to attend. I would like to thank Paula for chairing this panel today. Thank you so much for your time. And for our 3 faculty who've given their time to come here today, Killian, Richard and Mark, thank you so much. The purpose of this session was to give a brief overview of what the course is about. You know, you can read the brochure and it gives you a bit of detail, but when you flesh it out and have the opportunity to actually explain it, it gives a much better insight into it. We will hopefully open the programme for applications next week, but we will be in contact to let you know when that date is open, and that will give you an opportunity to register for the programme then. You will need, if you're applying and you have a degree as part of your qualifications, you will need to have some version of that, like a parchment. You mightn't be able to get a parchment at the moment with the ongoing COVID pandemic, but some proof of that. But we'll set that all out in that email so you're quite clear. But we will be open for registrations quite soon. Places will be limited. We'll be taking in 40 in the first cohort. So there is great interest in this programme, which is fantastic. It's good to see. It's the first time it'll be running. So that's really good. And it's a good indication that the programme will be a success and of great interest to anybody. So we will email you. This has been recorded today, so it will be available as well. So if you have any questions, you have my email address. It's margaret.darcy@iob.ie, and happy to take any questions at any time. But we will respond to those questions that have been in the chat and the Q&A today. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact one of the team at any time. Thanks so much. And thanks again, Paula and the other panelists.
Very welcome. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.